In the financial world, some crises kind of creep up on you. Others, they hit like a tidal wave. So today, we're going to unpack one of the most sudden, most shocking economic meltdowns of the 20th century, the 1994 Tequila Crisis. Just imagine this for a second. You wake up one morning, check your bank account, and the money you had yesterday is suddenly worth half. That's not a movie plot. That's exactly what happened in Mexico in late 1994. In just a few weeks, the peso's value got totally hammered, dropping 50%. A huge chunk of the nation's wealth just gone. So the big question is, how on earth does that happen? How does an economy that seemed like it was on the up and up suddenly just fall off a cliff? Well, to get it, you really have to look at the perfect storm of events that led right to the edge. And let me tell you, this event got a name real quick, the Tequila Crisis. But this wasn't just a local problem. Oh no. It sent tremors through the entire global financial system, and it basically set a really dangerous precedent for the rest of the decade. You see, a collapse this big is never, ever about just one thing. It's way more like a recipe for disaster. So let's look at the key ingredients: the crazy political turmoil, some really shaky economic policies, and the pressure building up from the outside. So 1994 was just an explosive year for Mexico politically. It kicks off in January with an armed uprising down in Chiapas. Then just 2 months later, the leading presidential candidate is assassinated. And then by September, another top political figure is killed. Now, if you're an international investor, these aren't just headlines. They're giant, flashing red flags that are screaming instability. Okay, so right at the heart of the economic problem was Mexico's currency policy. They had what's called a fixed exchange rate, basically pegging the peso to the US dollar. Now, that can make things feel stable, but the big problem was that the peso had become dangerously overvalued. It just wasn't reflecting the real shaky state of the economy, which made it a perfect target for a fall. And this is where it gets super risky. To get cash, the Mexican government started issuing these things called Tesobonos. Now, these were basically government IOUs, but they had to be paid back in US dollars. So just wrap your head around this for a second. The government is earning money in its own currency, the peso, which is getting weaker by the day, but it's promised to repay all its debts in a much stronger currency. It was a massive, massive gamble. And all the while, other pressures were building up right under the surface. The government was spending a ton of money ahead of an election year. The new NAFTA trade deal was in effect, which brought some optimism, but also a lot of uncertainty. And all this time, you've got these sharp financial speculators watching everything, sensing the weakness, and starting to bet that there was no way the peso could hold its value. Then came the final push, and it came from outside the country. The U.S. Federal Reserve started raising its interest rates. Suddenly, investing in the U.S. became way safer and more profitable. So what did investors do? They started pulling their money out of Mexico like crazy. We call this capital flight, and it was like a dam breaking, a flood of money pouring out of the country that Mexico just couldn't stop. So the storm finally hits. And the fallout, wow, it was absolutely devastating, not just on some economic report, but in the day-to-day lives of millions and millions of Mexican people. The impact was immediate, and it was brutal. In 1995, Mexico's entire economy shrank by over 6%. Now, to put that in perspective, that's not just a dip. That's a massive, painful recession. All across the country, businesses were failing, huge projects were just abandoned, and years of economic progress just went into reverse. And on top of that, inflation went through the roof, exploding to over 50%. So even if you were lucky enough to keep your job, your paycheck was suddenly worth a whole lot less. The price of everything, food, gas, you name it, just soared, pretty much wiping out the savings of ordinary families overnight. And this is where you really see that domino effect in action. The currency crisis spirals into a banking crisis because, well, millions of people suddenly can't afford to pay back their loans. Then the government has to step in to bail out its own banks, which triggers a full-blown social crisis. Unemployment skyrockets, wages plummet, and all that public anger starts spilling out into the streets in protests. The situation got so bad that the international community had to step in just to prevent a total meltdown. A massive $50 billion bailout package was put together, led by the United States and the IMF, just to try and stabilize the economy and restore some shred of confidence. But hold on, because this story doesn't stop at the Mexican border. The tequila crisis was a huge wake-up call for the entire world. It showed everyone just how connected the global economy had become and how frighteningly fast panic could actually spread. They call it the contagion effect, and it's like a financial virus. Almost immediately, investors panicked. They started pulling money out of other emerging markets, especially in Latin America. So suddenly, countries like Argentina and Brazil, who had nothing to do with Mexico's policies, found their own economies under serious pressure. And what happened in Mexico, it became a terrifying blueprint for what was coming next. That same toxic mix, a pegged currency, a mountain of short-term foreign debt, and a sudden collapse in investor confidence, that whole playbook would show up again just a few years later, and it would trigger the massive East Asian financial crisis. So what are the big takeaways from all this? Well, 4 huge lessons really emerged for the world. First, be really, really careful with fixed currencies. Second, borrowing a ton of short-term debt in somebody else's currency is playing with fire. Third, political stability and economic stability are 2 sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And finally, that contagion effect, it is very real, and it spreads incredibly fast. At the end of the day, the crisis was just a painful real-world lesson. It hammered home the point that you have to maintain solid economic fundamentals. And it showed everyone the hidden dangers of those fixed exchange rates, which can create this dangerous illusion of stability when really the floor is about to collapse. And that leaves us with a pretty important question for today, doesn't it? In a world that's even more connected, with money flowing faster than ever, have we truly learned the lessons of the tequila crisis? Or are those same ingredients for disaster quietly mixing somewhere right now? That's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me.